Howdy, I'm Petey the Power Dragon. I have some great news for people who don't already know. The Overhaul mod by the Duke, now known as the Damned Nations, previously the End Times, is coming to Warhammer 3. So you might be asking what this means, why it matters, or even who I am. Or maybe you aren't. Well, this video is meant as an introduction for people who aren't familiar with the mod or its creator. I will discuss general design philosophy and universal changes that you will want to know when first hopping into Warhammer 3, especially Immortal Empires. There are just a few disclaimers to get out of the way first. Beginning is the fact that literally everything I say here is subject to change. I'm implying most things off of an early access system. The video in the background here is actually the beta version of the mod, released to me in early access. So, lots of stuff in this replay could be changed by the time that you're getting your hands on the mod and the video. However, the main points I draw upon should still hold true no matter the time. Finishing things off before we begin in earnest, I would just like to talk about some really amazing people. So, the Steam page for the End Times and Warhammer II, linked down below, is another link to a Discord server. And we have some amazing people who are assisting Duke in terms of modding. Without these folks, we literally wouldn't have this opportunity at all. No, the damned nations. So I just wanted to take this time to shout out the special captains of Altdorf, because these guys are some real heroes, and no matter how much time I spent putting together this video, it doesn't really compare to the hours of dedicated time that they have spent pretty much slaving over it. But it's a true labor of love. So, just a quick shout out to Boki, Wolfie, the Castra, Penguin King, Dietrich, and Valis. Thank you all so much for your assistance and support. So what sets this mod apart from other titans in the game? Well, the Damned Nations has a focus on historical strategy, as well as realism, the importance of tactics, as well as how things would act in a more realistic setting. In general, things like Vigor have been revamped. Now Vigor costs more to be tired. Yes, and units tire quicker. However, resting as a mechanic is revamped. Now, units only need shorter times outside of combat to catch their breath, and go right back in. Buffs and debuffs as a whole have been changed. Less potent buffs and debuffs, and also they can give bonuses to your opponent. Final Transmutation, for instance, actually gives armor to people now. I know, kinda crazy, but that's the price you pay. Statues are hard to get through. Also, nets have pretty much been removed entirely. So, while I would apologize to Kairos or Slanesh, I don't think I will. Some races also have new mechanics. Most notable here are the undead, who now have a passive healing for all units. Vampires do need to be in melee, and constructs near necrotect, though. And these units, while the conditions are met and they haven't reached their healing cap, will even have perfect vigor, meaning that the undead are comeback kings and Russian slap-fighting champions. Demons have a slightly similar mechanic, called Rest in Hell, whereby, as long as their leadership is high, they couldn't really give less of a crap. The Bloodletter, currently screaming skulls for the Skull Throne at a volume so high it makes a chainsaw look like an ASMR video, really couldn't give less of a crap about simple mortal troubles like being tired or common sense. So let me ask you, what is a great part of Warhammer fights? Why, the magic, of course. Nothing quite beats that sensation of throwing around fireballs like a wizard in Dungeons & Dragons who just hit level 5. Taking it from someone who likes Tzeentch magic, it's just a lot of fun. It's also very different now. Some things people will notice right away, others not so. Beginning with the obvious. Ranged and wind up. Spells as a whole take more time to come down and have a shorter range. The windup is super noticeable, with the base vortex or wind spell windup moving from its vanilla 3 to 5 seconds now to an 8 through 13 seconds. This is massive and may have people initially thinking that magic must suck. Don't worry, if you look through the background footage, you can actually see some nice blight boils or constellations of the dragon, just in case you weren't willing to take my word on it. See, the reason why magic is like this is to make sure that people have time to escape spells, because they hit much harder in the damnations, like that. Which rings especially true for, say, overcasts. Overcasts bring in the Mr. and Mrs., and by that, I mean miscasts. Miscasts are now tied to overcasting, summons, as well as arcane conduit. These miscasts hurt the wizard much more, and also mean that miscasts hurt people around them. One person can actually use miscasts like a magical bomb. Because wizards can't drop as many spells directly on their head in the damnations, they can miscast to blow up things around them as a safety net. Unfortunately, there is a bit of a drawback to using yourself as a conduit for pure magical mayhem. You see, wizards are equally capable of miscasting and killing their own troops, as well as enemy troops, and they take quite a bit more damage from miscasting than in vanilla. Final things to mention are Greater Arcane Conduit and Arcane Conduit increase reserves. And summons are permanent, but balanced out by the aforementioned miscast chances and or hefty prices for non-casting summons. But trust me, there's quite a bit of tactical nuance to try and think about here. I mean, could you imagine if, say, while summoning, you accidentally moved over your summoning reticle and miscast and blew up the unit that you were summoning? That's just an example, though. I would never do that. Never. Maybe a couple times. So after that word salad of a paragraph explanation, let's talk about a simpler aspect of the damned nations. Infantry. Infantry performs largely the same across the board in terms of role, but more effective in terms of stats. A great way to tell what an infantry unit's role is to think about how it, well, functionally acts. Axes are really good at just kind of chopping through stuff. Anything with a large amount of weight at the end of a lever system, like, say, bardishes or maces, is going to be good at armor piercing. Swords are nice all-rounders, but especially good at defense, as they can be used to parry. And spears aren't your traditional defensive weapons anymore. Instead, they're used more like spacing tools. The best defense is always offense. At least these troops would have you believe. You can get some really masterful performances out of infantry in the damnations, like orcs, vampire counts, or empire. Things like massive shock troops, Orokin Templars, Bestigors, Black Orcs, and Plague Monk Censer Bears are some pretty good options. Or if you're specifically looking at it from a Warhammer 3 perspective, I can also recommend Khorngors, Bloodletters, or things like Exalted Demonettes of Slaanesh. In general, these units can trade off stuff for that incredible shock value, but they're normally very weighty and potent. There's also tank troops, the heavily armored Reiksguard Foot of Altdorf, Ironbreakers of the Dwarves, Graveguard, Tombguard, even, say, Pestigors, larger Chaos Spawn for Warhammer 3, your Sword and Board Zarguard hold incredibly well. These are just things to keep in mind, and you'll certainly pick up on them as you mess around with the units. Then one of the greatest changes in sections of the Damnations, Cavalry. The Damnations Cavalry is, as a whole, much better than in vanilla. While most stats change in the Damnations, Cavalry got a special level of revamp. The charge bonus on almost all cav is much more noticeable, but most important to understand is that Cavalry can fill very different roles now. Shock cav, light cav, holding cav, delaying cav, forest cav, spotting cav. All of it. Cavalry is no longer restricted. things can be so much more diverse. And believe me, the sheer tactical sandbox that this is going to open up for you once you realize it is just great. For instance, think about cav that are good at holding. Something for Empire. Let's look at tankier pistoliers or outrider scouts. Say you're on a cav fight in the flanks. You can use these heavier cav to tank a cav charge on the front, then flank around with a shock cav, such as Reichsguard or Empire Knights if you're on a budget. Get in that rear, win the cav fight, and then have free reign over that flank for the rest of the game. The last thing to really discuss in terms of cav is actually bracing. All cavalry, with some exceptions, notably monstrous cavalry, and other more specialized forms of flank troops, we'll talk about chariots in a second, can encounter something called bracing. An infantry unit standing still facing cavalry head-on, especially when they're equipped using a halberd or a spear, can have issues with bracing. Like in real life, horses won't charge directly into a spear wall, unless they're pretty suicidal. So if you suddenly realize that your cav charges aren't bowling through things unless they're ogres or chariots, this is why. It's also a great tactic for somebody who might struggle with these much more potent cavalry options. Just remember, bracing is always there. It will take a while to get used to, but honeycombing your formations with troops that have spears, ready to simply turn around and brace just to give you that extra time, will be life-saving, and it will continue to help you out. Of course, this won't work as much against chariots, or as I like to call them, Maximus Disruptionis, or Pain in my Butticus. You see, chariots don't deal with bracing. Chariots can't stop, won't stop. Chariots go, go, go. A chariot in the Damned Nations tends to have a lot more models. You're talking units of 24, 33, and 12. Yeah. You see, these chariots are obviously worse in combat than, say, your vanilla chariots on a unit-by-unit basis, but they make up for this in terms of sheer impact, charge, and disruption. You better believe these 12 exalted seeker chariots are going to hit you harder than one would purely off the impact damage. They negate bracing, are a great way to keep routing troops continuously routing, and they're amazing at, like I keep saying, disruption. But I'll explain more in depth. You see, a chariot is able to very cleanly push through things, and they can really screw with formations. Perfect infantry lines have to suddenly scramble, start bracing and maneuvering to try and get out of the way of a good chariot charge. And if you can keep your opponent blobbed up, even if the chariot itself doesn't really get its value back, it doesn't matter as long as it gives you the tactical advantage to, say, envelop an opponent, now enclosed around trying to kill this chariot, butchering its way through their enemy lines. So, let's talk about the topic that I really dreaded having to write about. Not because I think that anything in here is designed poorly, in fact, quite the contrary, but just because it's so different and so difficult that I think it's going to be hard for a lot of people to get used to. This is the steepest learning curve of the Damned Nations, ranged troops. I will split this into two sections. This one will talk about foot range troops, and the artillery/range support troops will be next. What tends to happen very early on when people are playing the Damned Nations is they get very turned off by how the ranged combat functions, and there are some through lines. Ranged troops have become less accurate as a whole, basically for those who speak fancy mod terms. The calibration distance, or the amount of distance a ranged troop can shoot before the accuracy substantially drops off, is much shorter on average, meaning unless you're using sniper teams like Jezzails or Crane Gunners, you're probably going to miss. Second, reloading times have become much longer, which already starts to screw with what people expect from a continuous peppering. They have much harder hitting projectiles on average, but your firing arcs are also less forgiving, meaning that a ranged corps as a whole does not an army make anymore. In fact, you're going to pretty much have to rely a lot on more combined arms, but we'll get into why that is when talking about how specific ranged troops function. The Duke certainly likes archers. He is British, and these are pretty easy to get used to as a whole. Archers have a more generous firing arc than most ranged troops, except, well, mortars. They are the bread and butter basic ranged troop with some variation. Yes, Wood Elf Way Watchers, with their obscene projectile penetration for forests and snipe while in the trees, may have you beaten there, but as a whole, these are units that you have just for general range. You see, other a bow. The main benefit of a bow over other ranged options comes from its reload. It's a lot quicker to draw and shoot a bow than it is to chamber a gun or load a crossbow. Trade-off is power, however. Archers tend to have less armor piercing than their counterparts, and definitely tend towards more methodical takedowns than bringing something down big almost immediately. So, expect these units to be a continuous peppering. And if an opponent looks at archers and doesn't think much of them because of their low burst damage, then they're in for a nasty surprise when suddenly that great unclean one has been chipped down to pieces by peasant archers. Crossbows, on the other hand, are your middling-of-the-road, jack-of-all-trades option. They take slightly more time to reload, more than a bow, less than a gun, and they won't be able to shoot over other units, even when on even footing. So why even take them, then? Well, they are much harder hitting. Single entity DPS for the price on crossbows is incredible, and if you don't want to be crippled with reloading, and don't mind a bit of projectile trajectory nonsense, then crossbows deliver a very efficient punch. These troops are really nice for factions that might lack guns but still want an AP option. Or, if you want to have threatening range, just enough to force your opponent to have a response, but not so much that you might be committing hard like with guns. So what about guns, then? Well, I'm going to talk about guns, and I love talking about the different varieties of guns. In video games, of course, don't put me on a watch list. See, the benefits of a gun are in terms of damage. Guns chew through stuff as if it isn't even there. Take a quick look at this beast of Nurgle. There was quite a bit more health on it just a second ago. Those are shotguns. These are your burst guns. But I'm getting too far ahead of myself. While the range of guns might be much more, you won't get much beyond just a light sprinkling of damage and some harassment. Furthermore, guns have literally no arc, while crossbows have functionally none. A gun shooting anything smaller than, like, monstrous infantry like a troll is going to have direct line of sight, which oftentimes puts them in danger. And, because of their high reload times, it means that if a gun doesn't have enough stopping power in a single volley to reposition, then they're going to be in massive danger. So, well, that immediately seems like guns might be a big turnoff. But believe me, the damage is incredible. And if you're able to dominate a flank group with cav and use the cav as gun bodyguards, you're going to get some good results. So how does one use this new revamped range? Well, the name of the game is positioning. Ranged units when in an advantageous position, such as in clear flanks or behind troops, depending on how their arc is, can be very impactful in almost every regard. Either committing troops at all, or just simply choosing to have ranged units to force your opponents to commit troops. But that isn't really what you want me to talk about to start off with. Yeah, sure, these basic foot range troops are hard, but what about the real hard ones? Let's talk about artillery. So, while those basic ranged options can still perform similar to vanilla ones, artillery don't at all. Artillery are the killers, or rather, weakeners of armies. As most range are, the ability to soften up an incoming foe, artillery takes this to its extreme. Troops like mortars are your dependable, consistent artillery, always making sure to put out a hearty punch, and not having to worry about things like silly firing arcs. Catapults or trebuchets may not have amazing usage of, say, shrapnel, but they have much longer range and can have some more interesting immediate base damage. Cannons and your stationary guns are super good at killing things like cavalry, and if you're especially cheeky, the ability to wheel a cannon originally up to the front of your army and play the long game, wheeling it around a flank to shoot down lengths of infantry, is going to be devastating on your opponent. And cannons pretty much force a reaction right away. Of course, you do get more accurate artillery, because as a whole, this stuff is a lot more hit and miss, or miss and miss, or we're just kind of aiming at the army. Don't expect to be sniping out specific units with this stuff. You're here to kill an army, not a specific troop. This is, of course, the exception for things like, say, light beams strapped to dinosaurs, or people who kill you by looking at you like a Medusa, or, dwarfs with big bows, because that also exists. So why play the Damned Nations at all when it makes landfall? Well, because this mod is truly its own experience. If you don't care for CA's methods of balancing, if you're a real Total War veteran who didn't originally care for the Warhammer franchise, even if you want something fun or new, I highly recommend it. This mod is in-depth, very in-depth. You'll rarely get bored, either considering the Duke updates the mod about as frequently as the dwarfs get mad about some grudge or Tzeentch tells a lie. So raise the banners and take your new knowledge in stride. Ride out to war and conquer as you see fit. Most of all, go nuts. And thank you all for listening. And a final thank you to the Duke and the captains of Altdorf. I'll probably see you later. Have a good one.